I'm sorry, founder, but you need to learn a new language. We cannot have a conversation if we're not speaking the same language. And that language is finance.
Hey, podcast listener, even if you are alone in your entrepreneurial journey, know that today, right now in your earbuds, you are joined by thousands of entrepreneurs from all around the globe seeking to grow better, more profitable, location-independent businesses. If you'd like to learn more about what we do and download our entire back catalog, check out tropicalmba.com.
Alrighty, and the topic for today's episode is what are credible and reliable ways to build wealth through your business? The first big idea is this: build your house on the beach, but make sure it's durable. You have a hurricane, comes in, it knocks out one of your pillars. All right, sounds good. Looks like we're trading the wood for concrete now. Yep. And if this doesn't sound exciting, one of Keith's quotes is, the goal is to get rich, not to get big. And getting rich depends on that house still standing. The next big idea is you must understand the language of business. I know what you're thinking, Ian. You're thinking Spanish. Is it Mandarin? Is it English? Is it the US dollar? No, it is finance. Most people aren't financially literate. Here's the problem, in my opinion. 95% of the people that start small businesses, they don't understand finance. And we are going to think about it through the lens of an author named Keith Cunningham. Now, Keith Cunningham has built a name for himself by writing two books primarily. The first is The Road Less Stupid, and the second is titled The Ultimate Blueprint for an Insanely Successful Business, with the subtitle, I really like this: Great Operators Get Tired. Great Business Owners Get Rich. All right. So I'm in, Keith. Sign me up, man. So what we're going to do is pull out the big ideas from this body of work and get a sense for his perspective and how it jibes with what we've seen over the years. A couple themes at the top. Keith's been around for a while, and we try to dig up some details about his history, but the basic narrative goes like this. There was a boom time in real estate, call it in the 90s, and Keith apparently made something like $100 million. Now, I don't know, what was that? How much of it was debt? What were the numbers? I can't find that information. But the thing that informs Keith's story is that he lost all or most of that money. Okay? So it was one of these high times, opportunistic, and it didn't work out. And what he subsequently pivoted to was, I wouldn't say conservative, but a more workmanlike approach to wealth and entrepreneurship. A safer, more reliable path to getting rich. And through real estate, through advisory, and through some other vehicles that it's hard to find information about, he ultimately did get rich. And I know that because I saw his watch on stage, and he wears a rich guy watch. So he at least has $80,000 to spare. Ultimately did end up building wealth using a reliable framework. And we are going to talk about some of those big ideas here today. Why don't we then jump right into it and talk about some of Keith Cunningham's biggest ideas and our take on them? Build your house on the beach, but make sure it's durable. And so Keith has this image of that business is fundamentally about doing less dumb things than doing more smart things. And this idea of you can do everything right if you build your house on the beach, right? You can have great amenities, open floor plan, kitchen island, guest bedroom, Airbnb, pickleball court in the back, you name it. But if you don't have storm insurance, or if you don't build it for a hurricane, all of your work could be wiped out in an instant. And this is kind of the similar ideas to Nicholas Nassim Taleb shares in his work, which is that when you're thinking of opportunities, you first want to accept the downside risk or mitigate the risks involved in doing that, because survival is your best chance at ultimately getting rich. So you want to do everything possible to stay in the game. You compare this with entrepreneurial journeys that I've commonly heard of, like the up and down, the big opportunity, the big talk, the big raise. I think there's a path to that. For example, you're in tech and you want to take 6 swings at the bat and you want to raise big every time. Often what I see with that crowd is you hear about the Twitter success, and then a lot of those people end up in jobs because one of the 6 swings didn't work. There was a risk in the system they didn't account for. They were swinging for the home run every time, never got on base, and never ultimately scored. And so really what Keith's advocating for is a strategy where we're going to build this house and we're going to make sure it stands. That's the very first fundamental of business, is build that durability into your business.
So build the house on stilts. At least if you're in America, that's a common practice. You build it on some 6x6s, get it up out of the waves. So when you do get that hurricane, especially on the East Coast. So Dan, I've spoken with several businesses that have survived for 7 to 10 years, but they haven't thrived. Meaning the owner's able to take like a decent wage, maybe barely replace their corporate salary over the last couple of years, but then they don't really thrive. So one question I have is, how do you ensure that you are not only surviving, but you're thriving? Because part of getting wealthy is thriving.
Yeah.
You can't just merely survive.
That's a great question. So what I've done is written down some risks that bootstrappers encounter and can try to mitigate. And I think the risk you're talking about, Ian, is working on just an okay idea. So one of the biggest risks an entrepreneur can face is working on an idea with wish think, or ideas that don't have solid fundamentals. If you have a vague hope versus a clear plan about how your idea is going to break good, this is how things go off the rails. So that's a real risk. A real risk is working on an okay business that needs something, a big deal, a breakthrough, a mention on the news, an appearance on Shark Tank, or whatever, this kind of vague thing that the business needs versus like a solid fundamental. This is our LTV to CAC ratio. This is our addressable. This is how we reach them. And this is our last year's growth. You know what I mean? Like the basics, really, that you can point to that are detailed. One of the points that Keith makes is when positive emotions go up, intellect can go down. He really asks the reader to consider deeply, and he has all these kind of processes, especially in the first book, The Road to Less Stupid, where he really emphasizes the concept of thinking time and trying to take your emotions out of it. You ever known somebody who's like, people that are intense, they can gin up a lot of enthusiasm for sprints, and that can be a really positive thing. But if you have a lot of horsepower without the steering, you can sometimes have this belief system based on emotions that at some point you're going to break through.
Yeah.
Take some time, have a clear plan, and change your thinking. That is a superpower to change. He has a great quote: when confronted with the opportunity to change versus to prove that you are correct, most people get started on the proof. And I think this is the concept of thinking time, assessing risk. And I think this big risk for bootstrappers, which is like, am I applying my time to an idea that has genuine potential?
Yeah. And most of this wish thinking, in my experience, Dan, comes from desired outcome that someone wants. So it's like, I want $1 million. I want this type of house. I want this type of car. And then, of course, you have to have some kind of conviction about what you're doing or what your business does to try and get you to that goal. I think that this is like some of the woo-woo stuff that happens. You have to have a vision. You have to really believe in it because it's what gets you out of bed every day. And it all comes from this idea of something that you want to be or do or have 10 years from now. And so when you look at this business or when you look at this vehicle, like you're saying, you might have some kind of wrong idea about whether or not it's the vehicle to get you there, because you have to have conviction to get there. But the problem is when you start to have conviction about the wrong vehicle or the wrong business.
I think there's a a very difficult, it's almost like a dialectic of reason. So the one part of your brain is like, for me to have success, to have the $1 million, say, I need to be blessed with luck. Let's face it, we all are blessed with luck. Just by being here, we're very lucky.
Yeah.
You cannot exist within a system that has a bunch of luck in it. So there's this mix of like, on the one hand, you need clarity around what point B is. How do you get to the $1 million? You need to have that clarity. But then the other side of our reason says, but I'm going to need some luck. And so I think that's the duality here, which is like, make sure that your plan, you might have a plan to expose yourself to more opportunities, which you could call luck in theory. But I do think that there's this genuine psychological challenge of it's lucky to get $1 million. Therefore, do you really need a plan, or you just need to like work hard and things will work out? You got to exist in that tension of accepting that luck's part of the deal, but having clarity around what your goal is. And so, like you said, having clarity that you want to have $1 million is not enough to manifest it. Sorry to all the secret fans. What you need is clarity around the plan to get there, to cross-check it with credible people that know about plans to get there, to cross-check it with historical data, to mitigate the risks that you're going to take to get there, and to make sure that getting there looks something that can be feasibly done, which it certainly can. It certainly can. But it's also scary to write these things down because it could take you 7 years. And so when you write it down like that, that's when the fear of success comes in. It's like, wow, can I really sustain this for 7 years? It looks tough. It's like going to the gym the first day when you want to get in shape. This walk of 1,000,000 miles starts with one step. And I just feel so far away. And so I think there are a lot of interesting psychological elements that making a change to a credible plan versus sticking with the plan and the hope that we're going to get there. The hope allows you to think that it could come sooner, potentially. And having the credible plan might look daunting. But the good news is if you have the credible plan, other people can participate in it. It's legible to other people. And I actually think the counterintuitive thing is your luck exposure increases. If you're out there projecting you're getting to 1 million, here's my plan, here's how I'm doing it. Now all of a sudden your team, your customers, stakeholders, people around you have clarity too around your journey, can give feedback and can participate. So again, we're talking about building this durable beach house, Ian. A couple other risks to consider that I think is really interesting. One of the biggest risks is excess capacity. And a pattern I'm seeing amongst really talented entrepreneurs, and the reason we've been banging away at a concept like labor efficiency ratio so much lately is that excess capacity represents a real risk in your system. And a lot of us have excess capacity on hand because we are hopeful that we will grow.
Meaning we have staff or personnel or basically overhead that is wish thinking or essentially sitting there idle,
There you
getting
go.
paid for, but is not being utilized.
That's a risk. Client concentration is another risk. Key people risk is another risk. Is your business dependent on key people or key relationships? Not having a power strategy, to reference last week's episode, proceeding with a mediocre ability to maintain margin represents a risk. One of the big ones that I think when you look back at Keith's story, greed and consumption from a business perspective introduces risk into the system. We've seen a lot of people get really greedy when things were hot the past couple of years. In a bootstrapper perspective, that can mean from overhiring, but it could be overraising, bringing on debt, having pretty flowery ideas about your return on capital invested in your business. You can boil down as he has like the Felix Dennis School of Finance, which is the easiest way to make $1 is to save it. Really thinking, do you have greed going on in your business? Could you proceed a little slower to reduce the risk so your house stays standing after 7 years?
In his lists of risks, very few of them are external risks, meaning competition, regulatory changes, interest rates, economic cycles, and whatnot. But I think this is interesting because most of the time when people are in this situation, when they're thinking about risk, especially inexperienced entrepreneurs, they're thinking that most of the risk is external.
Yes,
I believe when most of the risk is actually internal within the founder.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And the reason is because these small businesses are so pivotable, they're so durable, input and change, that if you build a machine that can stay alive, you can find a way to build for the market, to develop passionate customers, and ultimately get to your goal of becoming wealthy off of your business over time, irrespective of broader market conditions. We aren't the S&P 500. We can jump around to categories, to customer profiles. I mean, do the math. Getting to 7 figures a year does not take that many clients. Do that napkin math. So you can find those people in an up economy. You can find them in a down economy. Yeah, I agree with that. We're not as accustomed to the whims of the marketplace as larger organizations that have a harder time changing their offerings.
No, most of the time, these $1 million businesses are existing in multi-billion-dollar marketplaces. So you're not moving the needle hardly for yourself. It could be great, but not in the marketplace. And that's why a lot of these companies can exist, spin up to $1 million and not have a lot of friction getting there.
Yeah.
Because the market will allow it. And then when you start to try and break in past $1 million to 5 or 10 million, then you start to meet some headwinds. Eamon, who's been on this show, he says don't worry about competition until you're like 50 to 100 million. You should still be focused on your internal problems. But you mentioned concentration risks, specifically $1 million businesses having just a few clients. One of the things that you can think about in terms of having that type of risk in your business is it's okay to have a few clients up to 7 figures. What you mentioned though is like reevaluating that risk on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
So that might not be the risk in the beginning, 0 to $1 million. You might say it's okay to have just 3 clients. That's fine. Then you get to $1 million and you go, okay, here's the deal. We've got a problem on our hands. We've got 3 clients. We want to get to 5 million. What does that mean? That means we need to de-risk potentially in this one area. So we need to have 20 clients and we were going to get to 5 million that way. So what does that mean? Maybe we have to fire one of our clients because they're not ideal. Maybe we have to change our operating agreement or our pricing or whatever it is. So these are things that you can reevaluate, and you should reevaluate every 30, 60, or 90 days in an effort to make the property, the business, more robust.
Yep.
You have a hurricane comes in, it knocks out one of your pillars. All right. Sounds good. Looks like we're trading the wood for concrete now.
Yep. And if this doesn't sound exciting, one of Keith's quotes is, the goal is to get rich, not to get big. And getting rich depends on that house still standing. And so that's something to get excited about. One day, this business will result in me having $1 million. Therefore, I must consider the risks. Okay, so that's the first big idea. Keep that beach house standing. All right, so the next big idea is you must understand the language of business. I know what you're thinking, Ian. You're thinking Spanish. Is it Mandarin? Is it English? Is it the US dollar? No, it is finance. Keith Cunningham is saying you must understand finance. If you do not, you are not running a credible business. You are introducing all kinds of risk in your ability to get that proverbial $1 million in your bank account. How many times have you heard a founder say something like, I'm just not any good with the numbers. I'm just not any good with the numbers. I understand the impulse and I get it, but it's an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem. Fundamentally, this is what we do as business owners is we set number goals and we model them and we create those financial outcomes. That's what a business is. That is not what your bookkeeper does. That is not what your accountant does. That is not what your CPA does. So if you have those 3 things and then you're sitting there with the aw shucks, I'm not that good with numbers, you're screwed. If you have an accountant and a bookkeeper and a CPA and you're aw shucks, I'm not good with numbers, this is a Keith Cunningham intervention. I'm sorry, founder, but you need to learn a new language. We need to fire up the Duolingo and we need to click on the finance language and we need to start to learn it. But the good news is it's not that complicated. In fact, the second book, The Ultimate Blueprint for an Insanely Successful Business, if you think about the career arc of him as a business advisor, he comes in with all these cool, emotional, intellectual theories in the road less stupid. Let's get all hyped up and start to think through our business and get rid of our emotions and start to think about how we're going to really get to our goals and stuff. Cool. Now he starts working with a bunch of founders. Okay. People coming into his programs, people coming in for the 4-day MBA, people coming in for his one-on-one practice. A few years later, he writes the next book. 80% of this book is like, y'all don't speak Spanish. That's the problem. That is the problem. This whole book is about, we cannot have a conversation if we're not speaking the same language. And that language is finance.
So Dan, here's something that I think about a lot, which is basically you don't need to understand finance to start a business.
There you go.
Most people, they start a business because they don't like their boss, because they want to own their own time, because they saw somebody on Twitter that's making $1 million from something and they think I can do that too. I've got a similar skill set.
And you can.
But you do not need to understand finance
Not at all.
to start a business.
Not
No.
a lick.
No.
And you don't need, to be frank, you don't need to understand finance to have a multi-million-dollar business either. There are examples of people who've done it, and you can hire people to do it who understand it.
I was just talking to somebody today. They're a CFO consultant, and they were talking about a business that they're working with that is into the multi-millions that does not understand or have this function in their company.
Yeah.
And people can get a long ways without understanding finance. But like you said, at some point, you're going to have to implement this into your organization if you want to reach goals.
What this does is it exposes you to opportunities and mitigates the risks. For example, you can translate your business into the language of finance, which, for example, we do with our coaching clients. We can see right away the risk. And so wouldn't you want to know that at $250,000 in revenue? Right now, in year number 1, this is not going to work because you don't have enough margin. Like, look how this projects out. Look what happens when you get to $1 million. This doesn't work. So now we can get financial professionals involved, like the person you're talking to. We all are speaking the same language. And guess who else speaks this language? The people who will buy your business one day. So why not start the conversation, start learning the language earlier in the game? You're taking risk out of the system. It is possible to understand these things intuitively, and it is boring to talk about. So this is why it's not often where people are coming on a podcast and saying, what's your financial snapshot? What's your financial movie? Talk to me about your P&L, your 13-month cash projection, and talk to me about your balance sheet. And then what's your scoreboard that relates to all that?
Yeah.
But this is how you can speak the language of business with advisors, with acquirers, with funders. This is the language of business. It's how you can understand the feasibility of what you're building and make sure you're not wasting your time.
I'm doing all these DC Accelerator onboarding calls. One of the number one conversations I'm having around this topic, especially this is sub-$1 million companies, is the owners are in the delivery of the product and they have not yet established that there is a cost associated with that. Meaning, at the end of the year, maybe they're bringing in $100,000, $200,000, but they are basically baked into the delivery of the product. And a main concern or question of these founders is like, how do I get myself out of the delivery of the product? Basically, I need to work on high level marketing or sales, growing the company, but I'm still like very much in the delivery. The problem arises when you realize that you don't have enough margin in the product or in the price to extract yourself from delivery.
Yeah. In other words, you don't know the cost of delivery.
Correct. You do not understand the true cost of delivery.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And this is what acquirers care about. And importantly, to say it in a weird way, this is what wealth cares about. If the house stands for 7 years and you do hit a growth rate, you're going to want to know that information because it's going to predict how wealthy you will become off of that vehicle. And The final thing I'll say about that, this language that's fascinating, that it might not share with a language like English or Spanish, which is there's less wiggle room. So it is a source of potential truth. On the one hand, using English, it's like, this is how good I think my product is, or how good I think my strategy is, or what I'm planning on doing. Then you look to the numbers and you say, well, this is the profit truth. This is what actually happened. And then if I change these 5 things, this is what would happen in this scenario. Now we're getting a little bit more vague, but in 6 months, in 12 months. And now we're all looking at something where there's less wiggle room, there's more reality. And the more reality you can contend with as an executive, as a founder, the better off you're going to be. Imagine if you had complete knowledge, right? If you had complete knowledge of who's going to win X basketball game, the $1 million wouldn't be a problem. You would go raise the money, you would put the money on the basketball game, and then you would get your $1 million. That is the greatest business in the world, is knowing who's going to win the basketball game. Well, we're basically trying to get further on that truth curve here. And the way we do it is through the language of finance. Now, there's all kinds of interesting nuggets that Keith goes on. One, like just simple one I've never seen written in a book before, which is he's like, yo, you got to get off of cash accounting. You got to get onto accrual accounting. All these small business owners that I deal with, you're all in cash. Why? Because that's how we pay our taxes at the end of the year. Great. Keep one set of books for that. Now get onto accrual so you can do some real financial work. Okay. That's number 2. Now, a third set of books is y'all buying your boats on your business. That's ridiculous. You don't have a boating company. Okay. So if you're going to do that, which is a bad idea, at least have a set of books for it so you know the true financial picture of what your business is doing. All kinds of little nuggets. Here's another one. All cash can make a return, and all returns can be measured. Keith is an absolute stickler. Ian, we had this business coach back in the day that this was very frustrating for me, actually, and a learning process. I wasn't allowed to say what we were going to do unless there was an associated metric. He would not let the conversation proceed. And I was like, it's a brand thing or whatever, you know what I mean? I would try to like get past the gate, it's like, trust me, this is a good idea. How are you going to measure whether or not it's a good idea? And I would be like, well, that is a very hard question that I would not like to answer right now because I want to talk about the good idea. And there was always that gate. It's like a cattle grate. You are not going to feast in that meadow, Mr. Cow, unless the KPI is when the gate gets covered and you can walk across. You have to give me some kind of metric. And this is, again, getting closer to this truth, getting closer to something we can adjust to. Because that's the thing, is like the best businesses adjust the fastest. Business is a dynamic environment. Well, how do you know when to adjust? In a systematic, consistent, over a course of 7 years? Well, when you feel like it, when you're motivated, when you have a gap between vacations, when you have good juju from the customer feedback last week, or are you going to create a financial plan where you're responding regularly to the data? This scales. It builds power in your business. It builds leverage in your business. And over time, you will adjust to improve those numbers. It sounds simple when you put it like that.
I'll share this. Revenues are how effectively management is using the business's assets. And then profits are the result of how efficiently management is controlling expenses on a given amount of revenue.
There you go. That's finance. One final tidbit I'll share is he has this kind of anecdote where, okay, you get your finances worked out and then you have to start learning the language. And one of the things he noticed is that profit is a theory. Profit is a theory in the sense that you can't go spend your profit. And a lot of founders are like nodding their head along with this right now. You can't go take your profit to the bank. You can't go take your profit to the corner store. Profit is a number on a piece of paper. Cash in your bank account is something you can take to the corner store.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, what is the relationship between cash and profit in your business? And if you don't know this is the first thing that people are going to ask you when you try to sell it. What is the relationship between cash and profit in your business? And once you know, you can adjust to the reality. That's the beauty of it.
You bring up a really interesting point about having multiple sets of books in your businesses. Most of the time when you hear that idea, it's to defraud someone. So I just want to be clear here.
So like a business in quotes.
Yeah.
We're pretty profitable.
2 sets of books, 3 sets of books, maybe.
Daddy always kept 2 sets of books.
We actually run this experiment all the time in our business. We go to our controller and we say like, hey, I see that you're representing profit as X amount of percentage.
Yeah.
I want you to add this in so I can model what it looks like in that scenario. And so you don't need to like keep different active sets of books necessarily, but you do need to be able to like plug things in and out to model your percentages.
Typically you need your books to like for your tax returns. And then you need your books for the actual financial picture of your book. And that's typically where you're going to want to move to accrual. You're going to be doing your cash projections based on that model. If you've collected revenue in this year, but you're not going to deliver the product until next year, you don't necessarily want to be, from a strategic point of view, looking at that money as collected in that month, which is what most small businesses do. And it can screw up the way you make financial decisions in your company. Now, there's a third issue, which is like, I bought a boat. I bought a freaking boat and I'm, going to put my logo on the side of it. And I'm going to run promotions on the lake on the weekends. And a lot of small business owners do this stuff. And so look, if you must do that, then you can have above the line and below the line so that at least you can have the theoretically true sense for what your business is capable of minus all the boating. So to sum up, I guess the point that I'm hearing from Keith is like his second book, man, he comes back and dedicates almost the whole thing to the language of finance. And I've just heard so many founders be like, I suck at the numbers. I'm not comfortable with the numbers. I don't know what's happening. I think what Keith would say is that's not good enough. And guess what? You suck at a lot of other things too. And you've overcome those things. And I just don't think that this stuff needs to be that intimidating. I encourage you to jump into the deep end and have yourself on accrual, have yourself with a 13 to 12 month plus cash flow perspective, understand in a very simple way what your business financially means and understand what your key metrics are and make them simple. There only needs to be a handful of things that you're tracking. You don't need to do this work. You need to be advised about the work and you need to understand the work that they're doing. You do not need to be a math genius. Emotionally, when I got to do like a math problem in my head, it's like a traffic jam in there, man. Things really seize up. So I'm not a math person, but once I understand that it's just as much story as it is math, these numbers tell a story that you can understand about your business and then make adjustments to see the outcomes you're trying to produce. Let's move on to some of the other big ideas. So far, we've covered building that durable house on the beach and understanding the language of business. And again, we're talking about how to reliably build wealth from our businesses. And we're talking to the elders here, Mr. Keith Cunningham, vis-a-vis his word. He has an interesting point about culture, Ian. And I really liked it because a lot of us get into this thing where we write down the values and stuff. And a lot of the values are like, I'm going to say it in a soft voice. Our value is to provide more value, something like that. Or our values are to be honest. Everybody here operates with integrity. And so you have a company full of people with integrity, and that's great. Everybody wants that. So I've seen an evolution in this. When we talked to Anchor, the founder of Teachable in New York City, he said, look, this is a problem. You need to have values that are essentially more polarizing or that someone could feasibly disagree with. Because really what you're trying to do is drill down to get a certain type of person that is dedicated to your mission, that is setting the tone, and culture is something that can scale. Essentially what Keith talks about is culture are those things that you won't tolerate. Is having strong boundaries and standards about what will and won't happen in your company. He doesn't go into too much detail about all this, but I thought it was just an interesting way to put it. Where's your boundaries? Do you have any? Or are you just happy that someone will work for you? Because a lot of us find ourselves in that situation. And I think what Keith is saying is like, maybe you should have a list of things that everybody knows about that won't be tolerated at the company and what the expectations are. So that's a cool little nugget there.
I'm glad that this is going away, but culture is not beanbags and pool tables. I think everybody's starting to figure that out. So happy that that's disappearing.
Let's talk briefly about the things that are your responsibility as a CEO. And there's 7 things that you do as a CEO, according to Keith Cunningham. And not one of them is deliver the product. So here's the 7. Clarity on point A and point B. And you define this clarity by the language of finance. A is where you are, and B is where you're going. It's remarkable. One of the biggest things that I notice on our coaching intake forms, and this is not a critique, there is no A. A lot of our coaching clients right now, from a financial perspective, don't quite know where they are. And if you don't know A, it's very hard to get to B. Number 2, identify the gap and the obstacle. The gap and the obstacle. So what is the obstacle to getting to B? Can you identify it and focus all your energy on it? Design and plan the machine. So that's building plans, something we talk about. So now we're going through our GPS. If you want to map that onto, you have your goal, you know where B is, you know where you're at. We're doing some kind of like data mining to figure out what A is. So now we're making the plan in the machine. Number 4, critically allocating resources. So you know the obstacle, you know the plan. How do you allocate resources, invest capital to get there? And then the next points are related to that, which is you top grade for A players, top grader, you recruit and cultivate talent. You build that organizational chart, which is ideally focused on those obstacles, and then you create the culture. Essentially, you can boil it down to, according to Keith, a CEO has a picture of reality, has a clear goal, has a clear plan, and then allocates the necessary resources to get there. Essentially a summary of the Cunningham method. He has a lot of nuggets that come up in these books. And one of the things I thought was a big challenge for us in our community is growth. I think for so many of us, when it comes to growth, it's like question mark, channel experiments. What are we going to do? And so Keith's basically like, look, here's a checklist for you. So here we go. Number 1, the number 1 growth priority is to keep more customers. So if you're not keeping your customers, then fugazi on your channel marketing experience. Also, keeping more customers is a key data point that potential acquirers will look at down the line and should be a key part of your financial dashboard. You should know how many customers you are retaining on your scoreboard. Number 2, increase referrals and repeats. So again, we don't need more customers before we're increasing our referrals and repeats. Number 3, improve your sales process. Number 4, increase your conversion percentage. Number 5, increase your transaction size. Number 6, this is one of my favorite ones to brainstorm about. So again, these are sequential. Increase the frequency at which your customers buy. This is a really interesting one. I think that has a lot of low-hanging fruit for our listeners. It's like, if you're doing things on an annual basis, why aren't you doing it on a quarterly basis? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And then finally, the last one, the one that we talk about so much, number 7, increase leads. And the way I look at this is like, one of his big points in the book is like, he has this whole Felix Dennis thing of have crappy carpet in your office, use an old MacBook Air, $1 saved is $1 earned. And really what Keith's trying to do is have the capital return faster and accrue faster. That's the way we grow wealth. Not raising money, not making a big splash on social media. We're trying to get rich, not get big. This is a Keith Cunningham thing. And so when you're trying to grow, you want to employ the most efficient strategies first. So we're going to retain people because it's so expensive. Why is the last thing he talks about increasing leads? Because it's the most expensive thing to do. So let's do the most capital efficient things first. We got a customer, let's keep them. We got a customer who knows other customers like them, let's get them to make a referral. We got people that want to buy this stuff, let's give them more value and exchange more money. We got people buying these expensive things from us, let's ask them to buy more frequently. And then finally, let's go out into the marketplace of ideas and attempt to attract attention from new people. And so I really like this way of thinking, which is a checklist of how we're going to grow and identifying the most capital efficient ways to get those next dollars towards that $1 million in our bank account.
Dan, did you do the typical American, specifically boy thing, which is mow lawns when you're young?
I mowed a lot of lawns, yes.
Yeah, me as well. And so I kind of think of this as like my block I lived on, kind of like a horseshoe block, right? There wasn't an opportunity for me to get 1,000 customers because I just couldn't push the lawnmower that far. So what was the goal? It was exactly this. It was get your first 1 or 2 customers. You do a great job for them. They tell all your other neighbors. Before you know it, you're throwing in the edging. Before you know it, you're like cleaning out the flower beds, right?
Yeah. Typically, it's way more effective to develop better customers than more. Typically, not always. And the reason is if you're having a higher value exchange with a diversified customer group, you can increase the transaction rate. You can increase the referral rate. You can increase the annual order value. Now you're closer to the clients and you're able to even adjust to them faster, give them more of what they want versus dunking more people into the top of the funnel who might not be as well qualified. Typically, that's going to be like, if you're going through coaching advisory session, typically going to start with your current customers because there's more knowledge there. There's more value being exchanged. There's more potential for growth faster. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this little walk down Keith Cunningham Boulevard. These books are interesting, I think, because they sit very much in this sort of operational, get real, let's be honest with ourselves, cut down the emotion and the greed, and really focus on what reliably creates wealth in our community. And for me, that's why we're looking at things like Greg Crabtree. These principles can really help us to keep the house standing, to keep it profitable. And I think Keith's work fits nicely into the sorts of topics we've been talking about here on the TMBA in 2024. Maybe you give a shout out for anybody who wants to get their business broken down by diagnostics like this here on the show.
Sure. Hey, if you want to come on this show and get your business broken down, I think that would be a lot of fun, Dan, for us to dig into these details.
Heck yeah. I love this. It's super fun. I love these diagnostic questions. Actually, the final piece is Cunningham offers in his book a lot of these like thinking questions, he calls them. And if you just like put aside some time, come on the TMBA podcast or on your own calendar in a mastermind setting or whatever, and just ask these simple questions, the answers can be often very challenging to produce because you feel, man, I might have to change something here. And that's where these breakthroughs can really, really come from.
Email us, Ian@thisdomain or Dan@thisdomain if you want to come on and talk about your business.
All right, that's it. Thanks for listening this week.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Tropical MBA podcast. You can go to tropicalmba.com, get access to hundreds of back episodes and all kinds of other goodies. Load up your iPod. That is the cheapest way to fly business class on your next international flight. We will see you next Thursday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Daddy.